Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming out in the rain and the miserable. And so we hope to make a very warm and interesting atmosphere here for you all. I'm Mary Sabatino from Galerie Lelong, and welcome to Dialogues. This is our 19th dialogue with contemporary artists, contemporary curators, and writers to talk about issues in our culture. Today's conversation is held on the occasion of our exhibition, Sarah Grilo, The New York Years, 1962 to 70, curated by Karen Grimson. And it's on view till March 30th, so tell your friends to visit. I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. I'm going to give a short bio for each. Speaker. And if you want more information, you can check our website. Starting with Karen Grimson. She is a curator and art historian specializing in Latin American abstraction. She holds degrees in art history from the Universidad de Buenos Aires and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. There's where she developed her MA dissertation, which gave birth to this show. Between 2011 and 2020, Karen worked in the curatorial department of painting and sculpture at the MoMA, where she developed acquisitions and exhibitions for Latin America. She's currently the curator for the Craig Robbins Collection in Miami and director of cultural programming for the Miami Design District. Mateo Fernández-Muro is the grandson of artists Sarah Grilo and Jose Antonio Muro, whose estates he spearheads since 2015. His day job is as an architect and urban researcher. He is currently a senior associate at the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism and previously collaborated with the Philadelphia Murals Program and worked with We Act for Environmental Justice to develop a community plan for climate resilience in northern Manhattan. His award-winning participatory action research on indigenous communities in Quito, Ecuador, was exhibited in the Spanish Pavilion of the, XVI is 15th? 16th, sorry, Venice Biennial for Architecture. Last but certainly not least is our beloved Phong Bu, who everyone knows, I think, in New York. Phong is an artist, a writer, an independent curator, and co-founder and artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, Rail Editions, River Rail, and Rail Curatorial Projects. We all know the rail is going to take over the world, right? In the best way. Phong has organized more than 80 exhibitions. In 2014, he was named one of the 100 most influential people in Brooklyn culture, and in 2015, the New York Observer dubbed him a ringmaster. He was a senior critic at Yale MFA, Columbia University MFA, University of Pennsylvania MFA, and has taught graduate seminars in MFA writing and criticism, photography, video, and related media at the School of Visual Arts. He was the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the University of Arts in 2020 and the American Academy Award for Distinguished Service for the Arts in 2020. At the end of the talk, we'll open up for questions and discussion, but please join me in welcoming all of our distinguished speakers.
I'm so relaxed that I don't know where to begin. I mean, this is not the manner in which you should on a panel, which is usually sitting upright to hold up the energy vertically, no? But no, so I'm delighted to have discovered Sarah Grilo's work not long ago, in fact, and having been just at MoMA the other day for my friend Anne-Millet panel, I was so taken by the painting there. It's entitled Ad, made in 1965, which we'll hopefully get to talk about that painting in that context of calligraphic abstraction. But when I came here, actually, looking in through the works and then having looked at that photograph that featuring her, only woman artist among the 7 men including her husband, your grandfather. And I just realized, doesn't that remind you all the famous Life magazine, 1950, of the Irascible, where the only woman among the 17 men was Hedda Stern. So what does that tell us? So from that, I would like to begin starting with you, because in a way, you were the first who have discovered her. And in some ways, your critical essay is counted also the first study, discovery, so to speak. So, you know, in the context where we are today, it's very fascinating. It's important to embrace where we are and sort it through what's been neglected, what had been pushed under the carpet for so long. So with that, I would love to ask you, how did you manage to discover her work, and in what context you think where the work can be seen and understood today?
Thank you, Phong. I first came across Sarah's work when I was working at MoMA, and there was a proposal for an acquisition of this painting that you mentioned, Ad. I think it was 2016 or 2017 that it first came to the table. So, of course, I didn't discover. It wasn't really a discovery, more like an unraveling for me. And it was late because I had studied art history in Argentina, which is where I'm from and where Sarah's from. And you know, a very profound didactic of Latin American art had never mentioned her work. So in that sense, it was completely surprising to me. Her work was then included in a group exhibition at MoMA, which was titled Making Space. And that's when I first met Mateo and his family, his mother, his aunts, all of whom have done an incredible job at preserving Sarah's and Jose Antonio's work and legacy. And from that, I think a trip to Madrid followed, where I visited the house where she had lived until she died, and where everything has been preserved in sort of like a museum setting almost, from the decoration to the studio practice. And then when I did my master's degree, I was convinced that I was going to write on her. So that's in a nutshell, the story of how that happened. But since you mentioned that photograph where she is the only woman in a cohort of men, that group, which that's a group portrait of the Grupo de Artistas Modernos de la Argentina, the group of modern artists. She was one of two women. The other woman was Lidy Prati. And Lidy was married to Tomás Maldonado, who's also in that group. And Sarah was married to Fernández-Muro. So there's a reading of their involvement with this group where it feels like their marital status was a condition to participate in this group. In fact, by the time that photo was taken, Lidy and Tomás Maldonado had already divorced. Mm-hmm. So that might be a reason why she's not in the photograph. And Sarah went on to be affiliated with a handful of other groupings, in which she continued to be the single woman artist in an array of men. There was Buen Diseño right after the Gamma initiative, and there was the exhibition of 5 painters, which were 4 men and Sarah. And that all happened before she came to New York in 1962, which is the starting point for this presentation. She came here with a Guggenheim Fellowship. So she had sort of a very well-developed trajectory, and that was kind of the succession of her affiliations with other artists in Buenos Aires.
Yeah. So she was born in 1917 in
Correct.
Buenos Aires, and you, being the grandson, I'm sure you have a lot of personal story about her being a grandmother, which is to say it's not exactly the same as an artist. However, when did you felt this the strong desire to put forth your own energy invested in bringing the greater visibility to her work, Mateo? When did it begin for you?
Thank you, Phong. So yeah, Sarah, first of all, and you know, when people ask me, first of all, she was my grandmother, but she was not a very, you know, like a traditional grandmother, of course. You can perfectly imagine. We never called her or my grandfather, we never called them, or we never addressed them as abuelos, as grandfather or grandmother. We would always call them Sara Antonio. Antonio is like a familiar way to call Jose Antonio. And and for us, for my sister and I, for her younger grandkids, Sara was always our grandmother, and she was a painter, and that was like absolutely. It was one, like one concept, one thing. Like we couldn't detach my grandmother or my grandfather from their artistic discipline, from their, but they were, in our minds, they were not artists that were grandparents. They were grandparents that also were artists, And of course, with the years, that notion in my own mind has changed, and now I consider Sara Antonio like huge artists that happen to be grandparents, at the same time, which is not easy, and was not easy for them. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of memories, and again, like we would spend summers, every summer actually, together. Every Sunday they would come. When I say they, it's always Fernández-Muro and Sara. They would come home, to my house, it was like their son's house, and they would discuss about art. They would discuss about movies, the latest movie they've seen, they watched, and since I was a kid, so art and my grandparents was always like one thing. So in 2007, my Sara passed away, and 7 years later, my grandfather, he passed away as well. Normal, they were 90 in the case of Sara, and I think close to 90 as well, or 90 something, my grandfather. But 2 years later, my father, in 2016, when he was like 68 or something like that, he passed away as well. And he was one of the most, the most fierce defenders of his grandparents' work. And I inherited that. I inherited that kind of passion for their art. And when he passed away, 2016, I thought I understood that someone had to do something with their legacy, and that's when I decided to start a database, start inventorying all the works that we had in Madrid, in this like well-preserved studio that Karen mentioned, but not only the ones we had, but all the works that were around the world, and it was a huge undertaking, like a huge task. And I think the kind of the grief of like losing my father, and both my grandparents and my father, everything that got me attached to that world disappeared, especially with the death of my father so sudden. All that disappeared, and to not lose that connection, that's when I decided to take the lead of the legacy and to be involved, and I think it's the only way, if you have that passion, when you can like dedicate hours, even if it's not my first job, Yeah. So that's how I started.
That's amazing, because there's a certain level of unpredictability how an artist's legacy get kept intact and get promoted. You and I once talked about how lucky that Carmen Herrera had our friend Tony Bichara, who looked after her all these years that she had been neglected. At the advent of the Whitney show, 2017, she was 100 years old. So it's very fascinating as to whom will be willing to take on that responsibility. It's not something that you would come to you naturally. So I'm glad that you undertaken this task, and I'm sure you must feel rather happy that Karen have written the first critical essay, and the fact that Mary is shown the work. And I wanted to ask a few more questions in regarding to her artistic evolution. So we know she was born in Buenos Aires, certainly was somewhat trained, not entirely evident that she'd gone to academy or colleges of art like most European or other artists that we know have gone to. But however, the emergence of concrete art, which was so important to Latin America, particularly Brazil, in Argentina. So then, I don't know, it was eclipsed immediately within less than a decade, even less so, maybe 6-7 years, neo-concrete art that somewhat rebel against concrete art. So maybe that question can go to you, Karen.
Yeah, I love that question, especially because we see in this 8 years how language comes into her paintings. And you know, when you think about concrete poetry and the relationship between art and language, it really is a very specific dynamic. Sarah did not go through formal training, but she did go to a painter studio, which is where she met Toño, at Vicente Puig's studio in Buenos Aires. So that was sort of the extent of her formal training. And by the late 40s, early 50s, concrete art in Argentina, namely the Madí movement, Perceptismo, they were kind of already going through the first breakups of their very rigorous, manifesto-defined attachment to one another. And Sarah was already then, and I found a quote that she says in the 70s, they were already claiming that she was too lyrical to be concrete. So she was too lyrical to be part of the program. She was also considered an independent artist, even when she's in this group of modern artists. Yeah. So she's too painterly to be part of informalism because she never drifts away from painting. Even when she's transferring text, it's all entirely a pictorial medium. So she's constantly eluding classification. She's the opposite of programmatic. She's kind of allergic to the orthodox that those movements demanded in the 1950s, which was sort of a very hardcore adherence to what they believed art should be and what it should do. And I think Sarah's critical reception has suffered from it. And I've researched, the reviews that she's received since she moved to New York, all the way to 2017, because her paintings were still out there. And I'd like to bring 2 quick quotes of actually an article that's included in our vitrines, which is a review from 1967 in the New York Times by John Cannaday, writing about Gallery Byron's exhibition, where he would have seen this painting and 5 other paintings in this exhibition, as well as the painting that's hanging at MoMA now. And to conclude his not terrible review, but he closes by saying, "These pleasant panels are asked to carry a burden of social commentary that is too heavy for them. The messages are in no way articulated with the aesthetic character of the painting, which is graceful and fluent. Take the painting, let the message go." So that was 1967. 50 years later, in 2017, ABC, a newspaper in Madrid, a very conservative, monarchic, and Catholic newspaper, goes to Arco Art Fair, which is happening right now, in fact. And a journalist from ABC, and you might notice the letters here coincide, he says, "I turn around the corner at a fair and I see a painting that reads ABC. False alarm. It is ABC 1, 2, 3, 4. A collage with phrases such as 20 Days of War and other unintelligible notings. The work is by Sarah Grilo, and I think it's nice, but it doesn't say anything. It is too mysterious." He was talking about win, it's great for your ego. And what that shows is that we are unable to see what we don't know. We're unable to look at and perceivably discern what we're not familiar with, or what those men were unfamiliar with. So there was this sort of impossibility to recognize any kind of artistic merit in the work of Sarah. And I think this exhibition has been really fruitful in radically changing the instance of the critical reception for Sarah's work, including a review in the Brooklyn Rail.
By Alfred McAdam, terrific writer, on our arts in section. So, hearing what you just described, the first is being too lyrical, second, too mysterious. That says something about the work, doesn't it? So that go back to the very first painting, the small one, if you walk in on the right. It's relatively small painting. It's no more than 22 by maybe 18 inches, maybe 24 inches. It's simply entitled Pintura, which is painting. And I was talking to Mary yesterday afternoon how I was so taken by the network of delicate, beautiful deployment of thin line that is somehow get painted in such a way that I couldn't help but to think of Paul Klee, his poetic likeness, and the way that the intimacy of how the surface and the image get harmoniously balanced so beautifully. And Paul Klee, as you know, never paint anything bigger than that painting that I saw. And I was struck also not by the network of the delicate and beautiful thin lines, it's the way that he also structured it as if there's a certain summation from her absorbing both analytical and synthetic cubism. If you look closely, it is a still life. It's two abstract glasses and two saucers on the tabletop with a red band going across. And looking at that, I was also so impressed by the sfumato, the way in which certain condition of light and the surface get painted. Again, for those of you who are painter, know how difficult it is to able to mobilize thin line on a beautiful tight surfaces. Only few people can manage to do that. Paul Klee is one, maybe Ashok Gorky is the other. So I was so impressed of all of that combination in that one painting, and we go through the whole entire decade after, leading to maybe the first three painting here, where all of that network of delicate lyrical line disappeared. She could have made that, continue to explore that continuity from what she had created, but no. She essentially came to New York and then make all this painting where that entirety of that intimacy, that incredible lyricism and painterly eloquent, poetic, there's so much poetry in the work, to give way to all those much more monochromatic and blur boundary or deployment of geometry. So I'm curious, how did she manage to do that? Why, as to how? Because you can certainly build on that beginning. It's such an amazing beginning, and then just stop, move to New York, create a new body of work entirely. That's very risky. Am I right, Mateo?
Absolutely, and yeah, I think it's a great question, because she changed entirely, apparently, because I think that I think the way she deals with color or she deals with composition, I think she's taking it from her more abstract, period in Buenos Aires, and I mean you can. And I think that's a great, curatorial idea to put those two works together, Our Heroes and Orange and Mauve, a much more, informalist painting, and one, from mid-60s, where she absolutely absorbed, all these calligraphic and all the language from the magazines and all these kind of apparent chaos from the city. But at the same time, compositionally, all of them are still balanced, are still, they feel, you don't feel the cacophony, but you feel like they are quiet somehow, even if they are heavy, but they are quiet, they are. And I think she kept that delicacy in everything that she did after, her abstraction, or maybe after, the 50s. In other ways, I think she was more of a filter of what she was experiencing around her. Like that painting from the 50s, she was in Buenos Aires at that time. She was just coming back from a period in Europe. And then, of course, what she does from what she absorbs, it's totally different from what she does when she's in New York, absorbing that kind of like powerful and explosive, urban atmosphere around her, And something about that, I would like to, before that period, the abstract period, there's many paintings from Sara from the 40s when she was like in Vicente Puig's studio in Buenos Aires. And it's interesting that the late 40s, for instance, when she was, it's true that she had at that moment 2 kids, one born in 1945 and one born in 1947. So hard to paint in those years when you are like trying to take care of your kids and raise your kids. But that at that same moment, they Fernández-Muro and my grandmother, they went to Spain. Because Fernández-Muro had family there. That's a whole another story, which is my family. Anyway, we'll leave that for another talk because that's a long story. But anyway, they moved to Spain to be close to Fernández-Muro's family, and you have to acknowledge the context in Spain, 1940 something, 48. Like dictatorship, Franco dictatorship. Very traditional and conservative environment. Sara was always telling us, or she was always like talking about those years and how kind of gray and dark they were, and she could never stand. She was always telling that as an anecdote, but I think it's revealing of her personality. After dinners or lunches or whatever, they would divide men on one side and they would divide women to the other to discuss. Sara couldn't stand that. Sara was coming from Buenos Aires, and she didn't understand why that was happening. So she hated that, like she hated to be kind of like separated from men. And they lasted less than a year. Even if they had all, family support from Fernández-Muro family, they last less than a year. And there is a very few paintings from that period in Spain. Yeah. And then they just moved to Buenos Aires again, thank God, and then they came
So
here
when
later.
they were in Spain, did they travel a little bit to Italy and elsewhere?
Absolutely. They would travel. Actually, Toño Fernández-Muro had a UNESCO scholarship, and that's why they traveled to France. They spent like a few months in France, Italy. They came as well to the States before, like moving during the 60s to New York. So they traveled a lot, and again, like you cannot. I don't think that you cannot express something if you don't have your head full of.
When you live in between spaces.
Correct.
In other words, your nomadic life create a certain kind of mediation psychologically for you. My late friend Jonas Makers, when he traveled extensively throughout Europe, people ask him, where you were born, where you live, what do you do? He say, I was born in Lithuania, I live in New York, but my country is culture. So when you move the way that it seems like they did, you have to create a different kind of perception and it's create a mediation how you deal with the world, essentially, socially and politically. But it's interesting looking at those three paintings now, particularly the first two, if they were in Spain, this is a question for you, Karen. If they were in Spain and they spent sometimes in Italy, it's so interesting to think of the Scuola Romano, which is part of the movement in the 50s in Italy, where artists like Afro, artists like Antonio Burri, and Lucio Fontana, you know, and a few others too, Kipchioni and others, they were rebel against the kind of legible, solid, formal stability of neoclassicism in favor of more Baroque expressionism, which is so interesting to think that by 1955, Afro was voted as the best painter in Italy, who was so influenced by de Kooning in that same period. In that period, in the 50s, Afro's value was fetched more than de Kooning, internationally speaking, which is so fascinating to me. So the fact that she was never in New York in the 50s, but she traveled extensively in Europe in the 50s, so she saw what New York School or abstract expressionism have an impact throughout Europe and absorb it indirectly in some way. So is that something you find is evident in that early work, Karen?
Yeah, I think what you're describing sounds like this circulation of images that was very, very assiduous at the moment. So it's not only the people who were migrating, not only Sara Antonio, but also the reproductions. By going to museums, they would get into contact with these works. In fact, one of the leading reasons that she came to New York in her application to the Guggenheim Fellowship, she writes, is to be in direct contact with the work of other contemporary artists whose works she wouldn't find in Argentina other than through magazines. Mm-hmm. So I think that mediation to her with a direct relationship to the work was very important. And you can see how she mediated her relationship with the world in the kind of political sensibility that this paintings express, right? Yeah. And I think she found Spain conservative, and she might even have found something in New York that I think triggered something in her, even with a sense of humor maybe, because if you look at the transfer texts that she's using, and we've included 2 examples here, which are on the columns, but there's many more where you can trace what she was looking at in order to write, phrases like "it's great for your ego," which comes from this Subhose advertisement. That really complicates the understanding of what she was looking at. A lot of Sarah's art historical explanations have described her work as informed by the graffiti that she saw in New York. And I have a problem with that, because if you stick only to understanding her work as graffiti infused, then you're not seeing the larger forest, let's say. So I think staying on the graffiti only is oversimplifying the processes that she was undergoing. You can see she's doing freehand calligraphic notes. She's also using stencils. She's doing oil transfers. So a lot of these methods have nothing to do with graffiti. But certainly she was a sponge, and she was a frequent traveler, and she would have absorbed everything she saw. But I think when they were in New York for 8 years, other than a trip to Virginia and New Jersey, they stayed in the US. And until they left at the end of the decade and they started building their house in Marbella in Spain, which Sarah also built. So she had a curiosity that went beyond painting. She wasn't an only studio artist. She, in her mind, I think, Maybe your architecture comes from your grandmother too, right? She was an architect. She designed the house they lived in Marbella. They also together designed kind of furniture, and a lot of the interior decoration that they had in Madrid was handmade, DIY by them. So they were filled with curiosity. So I wouldn't be surprised if their early trips to Europe really informed where their trajectories went.
Yeah, so that was 62 when she got the Guggenheim Fellowship, which the family moved here. The decade 60 is interesting. You mentioned she was being a sponge, which is also a condition a lot of immigrants who come to a new culture. You just suck everything in. Whatever is worth, you just do it, you know? You can always squeeze it out later, but the initial impulse is to suck everything in. And in a way, the 60s was a very interesting decade, in a way, when she came with the immersion of already pop art, conceptual art, art and language movement, amongst other things. But it's really early 60s where the tail end of expressionism. I mean, the second and third generation was not at all what we were expected to carry on something new. In other words, rather than, let me just paraphrase de Kooning, say something very interesting. He said, the desire to create a style beforehand is a mere apology of your own anxiety. And that's what his criticism of the second and third generation. So you can imagine that decade was of people who want to change things radically, you know. So she had a show at Bianchini Gallery, was it 1964? All right, so that's interesting, because the year before, it was a famous show where Warhol designed the Campbell soup bag for the supermarket show, which included Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein. Actually, Roy met Dorothy, my friend Dorothy Lichtenstein, when she was working at the gallery. So that's interesting in that context. And you can imagine then the emergence of art and language, which is 65. People like Joseph Cassoud, even John Bassoderi and others. So you can imagine that particular period, 64, 65, 67. 67 is also very interesting. Why? Because that's when Art Forum moved from LA to New York with Philip Leder. And that first issue published with 3 critical lengthy essays. One's by Robert Morris, Notes on Sculpture. I think the second is Michael Free, Art and Objecthood. And the third is Solowit, Paragraphs on Conceptualism. So you can imagine painting was being pushed in the back burner. It was predominantly most welcome in the mix. Critically was huge. Sculpture, minimalist sculpture. But she's sustained, she's absorbed. What I find interesting, and you can follow up and explore further, is all of that I just mentioned is visible in the work. The idea of language, the idea of collage in the sense that we saw the beginning of the Rauschenberg, combine, collage, everything else in between, and the writing, whether referring to what Cy Twombly is beginning to do at the time, or even in art language, as we know, Cassoud and others. And all of that combined together, and then go back to it again, you said it earlier, too lyrical, too mysterious. So what does that say to this kind of synthesis of what had been maybe considered as an impediment, as a weakness, pictorially speaking? I disagree entirely, but I want to hear what you have to say about that. You too.
I think she was also too much of a woman for people to see in her endurance and her resistance in painting a valid proposition. And I think unlike Sol LeWitt and Robert Morris, in spite of her engagement with language, she wasn't a huge writer herself. Most of the primary source material that we've looked at with Mateo are epistolary exchanges with her friends and they were very good at staying in touch with friends all over the world. But other than one document, Autocrítica de la Autocrítica, she wasn't really investing her time in writing. And I think that was, like you were saying, at this moment in the US, it was a big deal for people to be invested in writing, in pedagogy, in self-criticism.
Yeah, I think she was mostly invested in painting. And it was almost like how do you say that? Therapeutical somehow, like something like really that came out from her. It's something that you really need to like invest your life into that. And I remember when we went to her studio. Maybe Toño was around, it's like the one I remember, the one in Madrid, that's where I lived with them. It was like 2 floors, so Toño maybe was on the main floor or whatever, doing something in the living room, and where is Sarah? Sarah is painting, it's like Sarah is in her studio painting. So it was continuously like, something really, at some point even Toño would say to her like, stop that painting, stop it. Like
Come be a grandmother.
Correct, exactly. But not only that. Like they would discuss about art, of course, and they would discuss about their own art, even if they have styles. They were painting like like this distance, like you were Sarah, you were Toño, but the styles are totally different. But they would influence each other just by like a couple. Toño would say, Sarah, stop that painting right there. You're doing too much. Less is more sometimes. Right. And Sarah maybe would say, yeah, you're right, or maybe she would continue to paint. And when they left New York and they went to Marbella, luckily, painting was their thing. They didn't stop painting. That's what they did. And they were not, they were not interested in like being a part of the art world or the art market. They were invested in just painting, creating. So, luckily.
But, the idea of the fact that they were not immersed in the art community in those days, also a myth. From what I read from your article, the multitude show that she had, and so did he, it wasn't that they were not virtually unknown. They were visible. It wasn't that they might not belong to a specific group. There's something about this country is very intense. Everyone loved to create a form of elbows room for their own niche. Only when you do that people recognize you. Being labeled is a form of success in this country, even though it gets consumed quickly and it gets spit out too. It's tough. But I think that looking at the works as I did yesterday, it provoked something in me that I didn't think I had seen it yesterday. It's only on my way on the subway this afternoon that I began thinking about the writing. What does that mean? I mean, at one hand, you feel that maybe she had deployed both hands. Could be the left hand writing backward. It implicates the desire to communicate to something, however indesirable that might seem. So that's one hand. The other hand is so fascinating is that there's 2 kinds of writing, as we all know. There's a writing of what was known as, for a long time, esoteric writing. From the very beginning of when philosophy was found, all the way to the late phase of the Enlightenment. But after that, it was sort of cast out. In other words, it's writing between the lines, writing that implicates a certain kind of subtlety that is very indirect. It's not direct, it's the opposite of exoteric writing, which is everything is based on external observation, external outward experiences. And it's so fascinating when you write between the lines. It's a form of political and social commitment you make. I grew up in Vietnam, so I know what it's like to be memorized poem, just in case books get burned, culture get destroyed. You carry with you as an oral tradition, you know? So similarly apply here, it seems that there's an inherent political social act in the way the writing is being carried on, so endless way of doing it. I mean, it's a symphony of writing, whereas you see Twombly is a certain consumable. We can deal with Twombly writing and some occasional symbol, you know, but here there's images from pop culture, there's a way that she deals with a certain phase or wording that she would take out and put in context. So how do you see that, the ability to walk between the lines? Am I making myself clear?
I think so.
I hope so, because it's interesting
Very,
to me.
yeah. I think when they came to New York, Sarah was a mother of two. She was a woman artist, and she was a non-English speaker. She was a Spanish speaker. And if you look at all the paintings she started incorporating language into, you would think she's an English speaker, because all of these phrases are in English. Mm-hmm. And then when she leaves New York and goes to Spain, and then when they go to Paris, the language in the paintings adapts to the environment she's in. So I think that's a way in which she navigated this experience of being different, of being from elsewhere, of being also a housewife. She also mothered her granddaughter while she was here. Mateo's aunt Veronica had a daughter in New York, and Sarah was the grandmother and decided to be the responsible caretaker for that baby. So she was mothering as well as she was painting and exhibiting, like you said. So that this fine line that you can converse with in her paintings, I think all have to do with her being different. Mm-hmm. And there's this painting, Homage to My Language, in which she inscribed ñ, this alphabetical letter that is particular to the Spanish alphabet, that has no place in English, that she would not have found in any publications in the English language. So she finds a lettering kit with the ñ, and she makes a whole composition about the ñ. And I think the ñ is a metaphor for herself. And by painting a tribute to her language, she's really sort of championing this kind of alterity that she embodied in New York at that time.
And the sense of color is mysterious to me too, Mateo. Because if you take someone like Rauschenberg, who was born in Port Arthur, Texas, he would take the bus back and forth, travel back and forth to Black Mountain College, where he attended to school with Cy Twombly and other, Dorothy Rockman was there, and among others, great artists we know. You can imagine he must have gone back and forth and seeing all this amazing African-American vernacular art, whether through Georgia, through Alabama, that whole route. African-American folks don't throw things out wherever they can find. If you look at the work of Thornton Dial, not only Holly and many others, they really put those things together with the abandoned appliances or debris that might cast up in the levee or whatever they found, and they were deployed with color in a way that must have impressed Rauschenberg, because the color in Rauschenberg is meant, as in vernacular art, as a structural means. It's not optical. You know, this is optical based, lyrical. One can even say tasteful. But that's the condition that we have to acknowledge and appreciate. Where do I go with that? There's a real.
I would like to just mention on that color, for instance. There are no like examples of that period in this show, because it was like mainly all the 50s in Buenos Aires. But color and forms and shapes and geometrical shapes was the main, I think that was the main topic in Sarah's work in that moment. All of the works were titled after colors. Actually, that one is Orange and Mauve, that's the title of the work. It's because it's orange and mauve. That one is ochre, pine, and green, because the colors are ochre, pine, and green. It's like what defines. That one is green painting. So all the color was defining for such work. All New York, it's words that define the paintings. Yeah. Charts are dull. Wind is great for your ego. Our heroes. Color is still fundamental, but it's not defining of the work. It's the language that is defining the work. So the first time I read Karen's thesis, like, where is Sarah taking those texts from? I was like blown away, because I've lived all my life with those texts. Charts are dull, with Spanish accent actually. Charts are dull. That painting was Charts are dull. Yeah. Okay? That one is Wind is great for your ego. So our heroes, that was how they were for us. And all of a sudden, they had a meaning. They had like, whoa, wait a second. That comes from a Chevy advertisement. That comes from like a feminine stocking advertisement. My family and I were like, absolutely, like discovering Sarah again, And that was amazing. That was like, okay, there is something there, There is something there, definitely. So my work is like archaeological almost right now, and thanks to Karen, who just like opened my eyes and said, okay, if Sarah is writing within the lines, maybe what I have to do, what Karen started doing, is like reading within the lines, and that's that's the work right now. And it's like trying to decipher Sarah somehow, and decipher all the work that she's done.
That's pretty good. So we have what? Too lyrical, too mysterious, writing between the lines. And maybe that's where we can stop.
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
I think the discussion is quite extraordinary, but I think we need to include our audience, who I can tell
I saw that
are
hit.
dying to ask questions of these amazing people. And when
before she shoot me,
No. Just people want to ask questions, and because we don't have a microphone, if one of you could repeat the question so that everyone can hear it.
All right. I take order from Mary. It's time for Q&A. Any question, and please speak in the robust voice so we can hear you. Anybody? And about anything? We are here to deliver responses. Yes.
I have a question. So in that archaeological work of finding these references within magazines, I guess it's like a two-part question. Is she looking at those magazines as a mother and as a housewife, as we do when we have a kiddo running around and we need something to occupy ourselves? Or is she looking at them as an artist seeking material, or both? On the first part of the question. And then you mentioned her humor too, and I'm curious, vis-a-vis that question about direct contact with artists, vis-a-vis the what's in the air in art forum and other places at the moment, should we be thinking about Charts Are Dull not only as a Plymouth ad, but as a comment on conceptual art? Should we be thinking about ABC as a mother with kiddos or with blocks? Should we be thinking about it as Barbara Rose's 1965 ABC art? Like, how much is she commenting on that New York art world, and how much is it, her home life, or both?
I think they're very suggestive once you find these phrases and you read them, and I don't know why it took so long to read the paintings, really, but it does. Charts Are Dull sounds like a commentary on Hannah Darboven, and I think she's reading these magazine adverts and kind of thinking, this is crazy, or this is funny, or this is stupid. There's, our hero says something like, if you think there is anything in the world more important than women, think again. And it's an ad for a shaving cream for men. So I think there is a wit to her gaze in how she's selecting these phrases to pluck and relocate, but she's very much like going through these magazines and flipping through, sort of like with her left hand while she's painting with the right hand, or while she's cooking, or it's part of that multitasking that only a domestic person with multi-challenges and responsibilities at the same time would understand.
Yeah. See, right, ABC? That could be Barbara Rose's famous 1964 ABC art about minimalism. And it's great for your ego. Maybe in the context of what she was so attracted to Life magazine. Life magazine was the most popular magazine that was bought by Henry Luce. And you remember in the editorial, why do I know about this? Because I'm in the business of magazine publishing. In February 17, 1941, he coined the term the American century. Very bold at the time when the American commitment to isolationism was so intact. As we know that FDR is related to Churchill. Sarah Winston is actually Brooklyn born in Fort Greene. So a distant of FDR, so they go back and forth in their correspondence. What is so interesting about that is that no one wanted to commit to join the Allied Army until Henry Luce declaratively coined the term, the American century. Great for our ego. In December 7, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And that's essentially what prompted Americans enter the war. So there's a lot of reference to that I find that she have undertook and somehow included in the work. Whether it's humor, whether it's political satire, or in between. I think it's very evident in the work.
Mm-hmm. And in the context of the Vietnam War, too. Yes. This painting is 1966. And Mateo's father was a young 18, 19-year-old.
Correct.
When the draft was looking for additional men to...
Which was actually one of the reasons they left New York and they went to Spain. But I mean, Sarah was a very opinionated woman. She was very inconformist. So responding to your question, like whether it was like, casual reading or it was like, very kind of precise commentary, I'm leaning towards the second, she was not doing anything casually. And she was, she was opinionated with everything. I have some footage that I need, I'm in this since like 6 years, and everything takes so long, and everything is so slow. So I need to digitize those footages. But there is one footage with Sarah, Antonio, and my grandfather. My father. My father is recording with a camera that he just bought. It was in the 80s in Madrid, in my house, and they are discussing about movies. And it's interesting because it's my father and my grandfather who are more involved in the conversation, while Sarah is looking at a magazine, like kind of let them speak, and they are talking about like E.T. from Steven Spielberg. Yeah. It was in the movies in the theaters at that time, And it's very interesting, like, such a, at least for me, born in the 80s, E.T. is like pop culture, like, per se. And they are like, what is this kind of new cinema they are doing? Like, this is entertainment, this is not cinema, So, and then of course they changed, during the years, 20 years after, they changed totally their perception of Spielberg. But at that time, and Sarah just like hears that and like turns back and, oh, like she said in Argentina, oh, no puedo, like, like I can't deal with that kind of. So she was very kind of, in that sense, very inconformist, very opinionated, and it's interesting because hopefully when I manage to, digitize all that footage, we'll get much more, layers of her character, and we will be able to relate it to her work. Yeah.
I'm glad she never surrendered to Steven Spielberg grandeur. The master spoon feed sequels and whatnot. All right, next question. Any question about techniques, about material? Oh, yes.
This question maybe is for Mateo, but I used to the question that I was just asking. I'm just very curious as a family member, and she being a grandmother, did she ever tell you what, in a couple of words, what was her work about? Because I think it's very different the point of view of like the criticism of what her art is to what she thinks she was doing as an artist that, not necessarily for the market, but for herself. I wonder if your father maybe, or if you ever had a conversation with her. I'm curious.
On what was her work about specifically?
Yeah.
It's surprising, but we never did. Like, at least I don't have that memory of her explaining herself. And that's why I believe that, even if everything that she did was so not casual and so informed somehow and purposeful, at the same time, I think she painted because it was a need for her, So in reality, no. I can't recall a conversation where we discussed about her work like if she was, I don't know, like Rauschenberg. You know what I mean? Like there was no need of asking her like, what is your work about? Like, no. She just painted. She knew her place they were very proud of themselves and of what they were doing. They were very sure about what they were doing. And thanks to that, all of the archive material that they kept, like magazine reviews, like catalogs, photographs, I think that was because they were very sure about, what they were doing, about the quality that they were doing. But again, like there was no, at least with me, probably with my father, but that kind of deeper conversation on, what are you trying to say in your paintings never kind of went through or to my generation, unfortunately. But at the same time, I think it's good because, that makes you kind of feel committed to decipher that, as I was saying.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
It's so interesting to look at the paintings like today when you think about information overload, and how, when you do a painting, it's all simultaneously arresting. It's like an arresting of the language, overdetermined language. To the extent that, like, you could say that today we think of language as a gesture rather than information, or maybe our response to over-information is like gestural, which is just so interesting. It's like, initially when I look at these paintings, I think of like Library Rivers, like using language as a gesture, kind of as a response to abstract expressionists. It's kind of very, kind of snotty response to abstract expressionists. Like, I'm going to put some language in it. But it's, it's interesting how these paintings can get recontextualized in the present.
Are you saying that there's no irony? There's lack of irony in the work. You can be honest.
I don't feel like informational irony. I feel like the structural irony.
Yeah.
Like what you were talking about in terms of Rauschenberg's structural palette.
Yeah.
It's like the structural kind of irony, which I think is much more. It's much more healthy.
Yeah, I mean it's a context of there's certain an incredible astute understanding of tonality. That's very important to put in that context. You can see that the first couple painting of when she first came to New York, she know how to do that, which is something that I would prefer thinking of it having a certain sense of temperature in each painting. How sometimes it's very overt, very easy to detect. Sometimes not so entirely. Some of this group of painting here, you can say that it might have been made in one breath of a couple of weeks or maybe months, but still you feel there's an order of temperature, how the calibration of atmosphere is being mediated very carefully. As Karen pointed out, these template of wordings of a certain imagery, a sense of very incredible interplay of repetition that interests me. I don't know how to respond critically about what that meant, but all I know that I feel there's a certain tenderness. There's a philosophy of tenderness that is very connected to what you have said earlier about too lyrical, too mysterious, In America, you gotta be very loud and you have to be super label and uniform in order to make a statement. So she's in between. She's not interested in either. She wants to persist in between the lines. And I think that's amazing in that context, today's context even. And the other thing I would like to add, and we take a quick question here, is that when I mentioned about Poclay, I was thinking about the transfer technique. In fact, the only artwork that Walter Benjamin owned is by Poclay that he bought, the Angela Novus, the angel of the world, remember? That he carried with him all the time in many places that he lived in, until when he crossed the border of Spain, southern France to Spain, that got caught by Nazi, which he took poison pill. That painting was left with Bataille and later to Charlem. And that painting have significant association for me, just thinking about it now, because the angel is terrified. He's fixated on all the destructive occurrences, one on top of the other, from the storm from paradise, blue. And at the same time, that storm occurring, blow him off with the wing about to recede. That he's confronting something, but he's also about to flee this enormous event, destructive event, And progress is destructive in some way. So in this context about transfer, drawing, the way that she have chosen very carefully what put on the canvas. At the same time, she doesn't want to make commitment and saying something very clearly about that commitment also. So I think that's something to think about. I haven't digested what that meant. We'll take one more maybe? One more? Anybody? From a painter would be nice. Oh yeah, we have a painter. All the way in the back.
Two formal questions. What was her starting point? Did she start, what was her planning process like getting into a painting? Did her drawings relate or plan out how she'd make a painting? Did she start with color or was it from her archive that she started with planning? And two, did you ever talk about scale? I like the squarishness of all these, and that feels very unique or strange
Wow. So, for the first question, it's really hard for me to tell you because as I was mentioning before, I know how they ended, just maybe by, okay, now it's done, It was, I think for her was more of a like a discovery of, like each work was kind of, because all of the works have many layers in them, it's like a multi-layer, and only in person you can understand that kind of multi-layer. Everything it's oil, it's not like a multimedia or anything. Sometimes she would use ink, but it's a multi-layer, and I think I don't think she was preconceiving the work, but just like finding the work while she was working, and that's why she was like Tonio would tell her stop right there, Otherwise, if it was like preconceived, the end was clear, When you get to the end, that's done, But she didn't know where to end, where to finish it, So I think she was kind of discovering it for each work, and that's very telling. What I'm going to say is very telling. Like, we have the personal notebooks from both of them, from Tonio and Sara, and it's totally different the way they approach the notebooks. Like Sara, there's no sketch like next to each entry. It's just the title, the price, where it went, whatever, a number. And Tonio, on the other hand, totally opposite. Every entry has a little sketch, because he was able to sketch the painting before or later. It was easy to sketch. These paintings, it's really hard to sketch and to do like a little figure of it. So I think that kind of responds in a way to your first question. And the second one, you were asking. The format. Oh yeah, the format. The format and the scale. That's interesting because it's true that most of the paintings are either squared or I would say vertical as well. Some of them are horizontal, but it's true that from what I've seen in the database and all the inventory, most of them are square and vertical. And she started doing like big scale works in New York, and I think as dull as that can sound, or as weird as that can sound, it's depending on the media or the space where they were creating, and the possibilities they had. And I think that happens in architecture as well. And as an architect, space defines what you're doing within that space. And in Buenos Aires, they would paint in a very small studio. That's why most of the paintings are like really like small scale. In New York, they had a beautiful penthouse studio, double height. They were able to paint like big scale, like Charles Ardal for instance. In Madrid, they had a big space as well. But you cannot find like huge, I think that's the biggest you can find from maybe combining two of them as a diptych, which is the one that it's on the photo over there, which is called Mr. President. And I think in Spain, at least, it's because they didn't have a way to move the canvas in or out from the studio unless they, and that talks to the inventiveness that they had. If you see their studio in Madrid, the living room table, it's glass, and below the living room table, the coffee table, a huge coffee table in glass. It's not a table per se. It's used as a table, but it's a how do you call it? A skylight, which is bringing light to Sara's studio below, and they can remove the glasses. And they could bring from, thanks to that table, they could bring out the paintings. And that was the only way they could do like big paintings. Otherwise, she would have. So that's what I mean. Like the space where they were, I think conformed the shape of the paintings where that they created.
Yeah, I think that's very sensible because scale is pragmatic issue. I don't think it's a formal aspiration. I think that's where it is. That's how sometimes we see a lot of European painting take someone like Giorgio Morandi, whose studio is his bedroom, stuck between the kitchen and his sister's room in Bologna. It's tiny, no more than that room in there on the second gallery. So I think that dictates, as you say, some of the works here. And I must say, in spite of it all, what we have discussed, there's a sense of intimacy. So if it's mysterious, if it's lyrical, it's intimacy that can be brought in the poetic sense. And with that, we end, and thank you for being here.
For our dialogues, and thank you to Phong, thank you to Karen, thank you to Mateo, and you can look on our website to look at this talk again, and thank you for being a fantastic audience.